The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So the government shutdown continues. TSA agents continue to not be paid. And it's actually getting so bad now that TSA has had to call in backup officers because the number of absences from these unpaid TSA workers have gotten to the point where they are more than just slightly understaffed without calling what they call national deployment officers to operate some TSA checkpoints. I feel so mixed about this, Pat, because on the one hand, this is a really big problem, right? When you start to have a disruption to airport security, you are starting to risk a disruption to the airline industry and to the operation of airports, which we saw Miami, for example, had to shut down one terminal. And that starts to prevent both industry and people from just being where they need to be, being from where they want to be. The counterpoint is merely that in tests of security protocols by TSA, like we would call them self-tests, as many as 90 or 95% of banned items have gotten through TSA airport screening. So on the one hand, it's terrible that airport security is being affected. On the other hand, let's not forget how ineffective TSA has been found to be in many of their self-tests. But it's important to remember that to some degree, even the presence of TSA, even when banned items get by, is a deterrent, presumably, to more bad stuff that bad people would try to do.
Well, regardless of your opinions on the TSA, it's important to point out that we have to have some form of airport security. And I think it's a real problem that these TSA agents are not strictly concerned with what's going on at the airport, whether or not someone's trying to smuggle something or try to get a bomb on the plane. If they're not entirely focused on that, and instead they have to worry about if they're going to get a paycheck and be able to pay their rent and their kids' tuition and all of that stuff, it's going to be a giant distraction to them. And the last people I want distracted are people who are working in airports. Same thing's going on with air traffic controllers. I think that is a real big concern.
No question about it. And I think back to, not that it matters, not that one TSA agent matters more than another, but I think back to the nice TSA agent who stopped me, or not stopped me, but I guess she stopped me in the sense that she was checking my ID in New Orleans in August when I was at Netroots Nation, and I handed her my ID, and she looks at it and looks up at me and goes, "David Pakman, I am a big fan of your show." She's now not getting paid, and she and hundreds of thousands of other government employees are not getting paid. And no matter what you think about the degree of training that TSA agents get or the effectiveness of TSA, what's taking place is wrong, and it's optional, and it's a political tantrum. And to a certain degree, you can't argue that that aviation is as safe as a result of this. You could say, Pat, it's 98% as safe, or it's 99% as safe, but this has decreased the safety to some degree, and we could argue about what level of decrease that is.
Yeah, and God forbid there is a terrorist attack during the government shutdown. Who would take the blame for that? I think the principal person to be blamed would be Donald Trump, because this is his shutdown, and he's supposed to be one of these Republicans who are all for law enforcement. Well, if you stop paying your workers, they're going to call out sick. They're not going to want to show up to work, and you're going to have to find replacements. And you could easily make the argument that we were less safe under the shutdown and put the blame of the attack onto the president.
Yeah, and even Trump, when it was Obama who was president, said if there's a shutdown, it stops with the person. The buck stops with the person at the top. Ultimately, responsibility is with the person at the top. It doesn't seem like it's applying here for sure. Senator Ted Cruz, and Congressman Francis Rooney are proposing a constitutional amendment which would put term limits on members of both houses of Congress. The amendment is co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, by Mike Lee, by David Perdue, and it would put a limit on senators of 2 6-year terms and a limit for House members of 3 2-year terms. Ted Cruz has proposed this before. Of course, it's not going to pass, even though Donald Trump has voiced some support for term limits for members of Congress. And I think that so first of all, I actually support term limits for members of Congress. And I know that last week during a live stream, or maybe it was during live calls, I got a call from someone saying as progressives, we should be against term limits. And I don't even remember the argument that was being made, but there is some progressive argument you can come up with about being against term limits. But I've laid out the pros and cons for a while, Pat. I support this. This is not going to pass. And just because Ted Cruz wants it to pass doesn't mean that we have to now think of Ted Cruz as a political ally of any kind. Sometimes people you disagree with 99% of the time propose something that you like, and that's okay. We still think that Ted Cruz needs to go.
Yeah, every now and then, though, there is a glimmer of hope from Ted Cruz. Like, he was in support of allowing drugs from Canada to come over to the U.S. Without FDA approval, and that was something that we supported. So sometimes he's right on the policy matters. This, of course, doesn't have any chance at passing, of course, because I don't see senators and representatives voting to get rid of their own power. They want to keep that going to the greatest extent possible. But I think there would be a great amount of good that comes out of term limits. Just one thing as an example would be that the people that you have heading committees wouldn't necessarily be the people who have been there the longest, who have the most seniority and the most ins with the party. I think it would actually be those who are most qualified. Like if you have a science committee, maybe the representative who actually is a scientist and has a science background would be the head of the committee instead of someone who's just been sitting in Congress for 35 years and it's just their due time.
Here's a question I have about how this would be applied. Imagine that term limits are passed. You're limited to 3 terms in the House. You're limited to 2 terms in the Senate. Do existing incumbents get grandfathered and accepted from that rule? Or if you are on your 5th term in the House, that just means you're out after that term and you can't run for re-election. I assume it's the latter, right? Because otherwise, with the power of incumbency, you could pass this and it would still allow certain members to serve 10 terms and then retire when they want to, rather than being term limited. I think you have to enforce it on everybody immediately.
Maybe there's a third option there. So you're not necessarily grandfathered in, but regardless of how many terms you've already served, you still could only serve 2 more if you're a senator or 3 more if you're a congressman. So like if you're a senator who's been around for, let's say, 4 terms, that's 24 years, you could still do 2 more terms. And if you're a House member who's been around for, let's say, 10 elections, you've been serving 20 years, you still get 3 more. That's how I would do it anyway.
I sort of don't like that. I think it's just better for them to be immediately term limited. Although this is exactly why it's very unlikely to pass, because so many people who are currently in the House and Senate would immediately have to go. And that is one of the, much like with campaign finance reform, a lot of the people, everyone got in to office with the system that we currently have. So by definition, they are not going to be particularly incentivized to change that system. But I support this, and I would love to someday see it become a reality. We are learning that Donald Trump is planning to have a second summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, reportedly in late February, but that the sanctions on North Korea are going to remain. This is after we found out that Donald Trump had a meeting with North Korea's top nuclear negotiator, and there was this whole diplomatic hubbub in Washington, D.C. because of the visit of Kim Yong-chol, who's a former spy chief, and this suggested that maybe there's some movement in that denuclearization that we were promised North Korea would be doing, which of course has completely stalled. And now we are being told that there is going to be a new summit near the end of February. We don't yet know the details of it. We don't yet even know where it's going to be. And for now, I have no reason to be anything but skeptical, Pat. The first summit was completely bogus. Trump went. North Korea made the same vague promises that they had made many times and never kept. And nothing happened. And we basically never heard about it after Donald Trump tweeted his success on the flight back from Singapore and that we don't have to worry about North Korean aggression and nuclear weapons anymore. No real progress to be made. And now they're going to do it again.
Yeah, like if there was actual successes that came out of the first meeting, you could totally justify doing another one. Like if North Korea started to denuclearize and maybe we started lifting some of the sanctions off of them, and maybe even pulled some of our own missiles from the peninsula, or our own military from the peninsula, then you're making progress, you're making some steps in the right direction, and it would totally make sense to have a follow-up meeting a year later. But nothing like that has happened. So this just sounds like another opportunity for the two to get together, to take some photos, and for Trump to distract, which is what he always wants to do, especially now with the Russia investigation ramping up even more, with the government shutdown continuing. I think that the media was very positive to him after the Singapore summit, and he wants to relive that glory.
Yeah, both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump benefit from just coverage of the fact that they're meeting. Kim Jong-un likes it because he wants to be at the table with an American president. This is something that North Korean leaders have wanted for a very, very long time. Most American presidents have not been willing to do so because they required preconditions which North Korean leadership has never been willing to commit to. Donald Trump didn't do that, partially because he just has no idea how these things work. Trump, for his part, likes the idea of being seen as the person that was able to get the meeting with Kim Jong-un, even though, of course, as I mentioned, they were willing and interested in meeting with American presidents for a long time. It was the U.S. who said, no, we need some conditions. But the distraction effect, particularly, I mean, listen, we don't know what the trajectory of the Mueller investigation and of new House of Representatives investigations are going to be. We don't know the trajectories of those things, but it stands to reason that 5 weeks from now, if that's indeed when this second summit takes place, there will be stuff going on that Donald Trump would love to distract from with more news and wall-to-wall coverage of another meeting with Kim Jong-un. Although you have to assume, Pat, that if the meetings keep happening and no progress takes place, eventually media is just going to get bored with it.
You think so? I think those two characters together in the same room, that will always garner some media attention. Like Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un together in the same room. I think you got to cover that.
It'll get attention and it will get coverage. It's not going to be ignored, but it's not going to be covered with the fanfare of this is the point where we will remember from this point forward, everything changed with North Korea. I just don't think there will be that type of sort of effusive coverage that we saw before. But listen, 5 weeks in this climate is like 5 years, and who knows what could be going on at the end of February. And as far as we know, the way the Trump administration has operated, in a week, the entire thing could be off. It's just going to have to be a wait and see type of game. That's it for today. It's Martin Luther King Day. We did a new show. When we don't do a new show on Martin Luther King Day, people often get very, very mad at us. And we wouldn't have done one today were it not for the fact that we just had two sort of pretty recent 4-day weekends because of the end of the year holiday schedule. So we did it. We're here. And now people will simply be mad that we didn't observe Martin Luther King Day and ignored it by doing a show. But I welcome those emails, and we'll be back with a new show and a new bonus show tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.